Basically, there are two fields in this case for me. The first one is my work in slum upgrades, in housing and that sort of thing. The second is the more, I would say, academic side of things. So the first 10 was when I was working in South Africa in Johannesburg. I was working for a big commercial company, and we were asked by the government to experiment with one development project. So it was not really, we gave it a try. It proved to be quite difficult and not quite what we're used to, and the outcome was not that great. But what it did do for me is that it exposed the more social side of architecture, which kind of struck my fancy and gave me a little bit more of a sense of purpose in architecture than just good design and making money and that sort of thing. So that was really the first 10. And that experience led me to quit my job actually. And I then set up my own practice, which I ran for a couple of years, specifically looking at slum upgrade projects. And yeah, I think the second turn to a more academic consideration was due to the second experience I had in my own company. So I worked on a couple of housing projects, slum upgrade projects, and it was much more difficult than I'd anticipated. And there was a lot I didn't know. And a lot of the projects didn't work out as I had expected. And it left me with a lot more questions than answers. And that in the end kind of forced me to either quit what I was doing completely or to find out a little bit more about it. And so I chose to do a master's in development. And that's how it led me to where I am now. Well, for the commercial company, the big challenge was, first of all, the money. It was not commercially viable at all. So, for the kind of money that I was invoicing out as an expert then, it would not cover even half the time that we needed for the slum upgrade project. So that was the very first, let's say, realistic problem, which I have to say was never verbally expressed, but you would kind of drag your feet and. So that was the first failure. The second failure is that the ideas of the commercial company in terms of slum upgrade were quite contrary to the reality on the ground. To be perfectly fair, we were a I don't know, suburban kind of practice, and we did go into urbanism and all of that. We are well known for it, in fact. But in terms of slum upgrades, it's a completely different kind of urbanism. And I think that problem was partly, like I said, the money, but also it kind of exposed the limits of our expertise. And I suspect the project was terminated because it kind of exposed that weakness in our company. But again, that's something I would deny if I'm asked again. It's a little bit difficult, that question, and it's something I have to confess it has been my preoccupation for the past decade, maybe. First in a practical sense, and now in a more academic sense. But the first issue, I think, from my experience, is that one needs to understand that in a, let's call it subaltern urbanism, you are dealing with a very completely different sort of logic. The mistake we make is that we think there is no logic in those. We think there is no kind of politics or economics or sense of life, but there is. And as long as you don't understand that, your ideas will always run contrary to what's actually going on. And if that persists, you are guaranteed to fail. So in terms of solutions, wow, it's a big question. I'm not sure I have met anyone who has a solution as such, but I do have a little bit of a better understanding now. My practical projects in housing specifically are located in South Africa, in Johannesburg mainly. I did a few in Alexandra Township. It's a fairly well-known I won't call it a slum as such, but it is a, let's call it an subaltern environment. Yeah, so that's where I got most of my practical experience in the slum development and so forth. The academic project, in fact, took place in Europe and still is located here. So I did a couple of masters in Germany, Barcelona, and currently in Belgium. Now, through the current research I'm looking at, I'm working with an NGO. Well, it's not an NGO. It's more like a charity slash, you know, development company based in the UK. And interestingly enough, to answer the problem of subaltern urbanism, I've had to get involved in an agricultural project to experiment with an interesting, let's say, approach to development. Okay, well, the basic idea or the theory, let's say, is that I had, we kind of, let me say, I discovered that the problem is not just in the work itself, but it's in the approach that we take towards development. And I started to identify several factors that make this problematic. The most basic and most obvious is that when we go into slum upgrades or any development, really, most of the stuff we do comes from ideas that are coming from outside the area of intervention. So it's ideas from outside, money from outside, processes from outside, experts from outside, and so forth. And I know the ideas such as participation try to bridge that gap, but usually what they do is that they allow people to participate in someone else's idea. So it's not really in the true sense. And in this new project, we try to start from the bottom up. It sounds very cliche, kind of overdone, but there's no good vocabulary to explain it. So it's centered pretty much on the farmers on the ground. And what we've done is analyze what their situation is because we believe that the poverty that they face is not something that is simply inherent to them. It is something inherent in their location in terms of economics, in terms of society, and so forth. So instead of trying to intervene in their life, we try to intervene in the systems around them that, let's say, produce that kind of poverty, right? And in so doing, it allowed small scale farmers to have a very friendly access to the market, which is usually the problem. So this is not, in a sense, a development project as such, but it's not entirely a business project as such. It's more like a social enterprise, but not even that. I'm not quite sure how to name it as yet, so it's still experimental. The output so far is we've been able to reach about 4,000 farmers. That's in the past 5 years. And we've allowed these people to actually access the market in a very, very fantastic way. And we've got space for at least another 2,000 under the project that we are working on. But the primarily, I would say the core element or the core characteristic of what we do is that this is not a project in the sense that it has a beginning date and an end date. It's not like that. The second part is that it's not a project in the sense that people are forced to do one thing as well. So it's also not closed in that sense. And in fact, it's more open. People float in and out as they see value in what we do. The idea now is having found an interesting model that can be applied in terms of poverty alleviation. The trick is to now import this back into urbanism. What I have distilled as an approach from this new is something that I called systemic capture. The point is, if you understand the systems around the poverty, you've got to realize that it is those systems that need to be perverted in order to turn around the situation. It's not enough to just pick one person and give them a fish, or even teach one person to fish. That's quite condescending because it doesn't change any of the systemic causes around it. So you've got to address the systemic issue, and that is why I try to go into it in terms of a capture rather than a revolution. Now, in housing, the same applies. In terms of access to housing, in terms of right to the city, those kind of ideas, it's simply a matter of one group of people claiming access to space, which at the moment they are not allowed to. It's an issue of power, really, in the end. And the question is, in those situations, how do you help those poor people to access enough power to lay claim to space, to housing, and to processes that can allow them to build up for themselves shelters and their basic needs. And those things cannot be decoupled from economics and social issues and politics and so on. That is quite a thing. In fact, when I say we, I mean me and a few colleagues who also came through Mundo Sabano a few years ago, not that many. Uh, we got together, in fact, to try to answer exactly that question. For most of us, it was the first time we were exposed to other professionals whom we had to work with hand in hand, day and night, pretty much. And it was very confusing in the end when you've completed this interdisciplinary masters to know what your job is in the end. Do you go back to what you were doing with a better insight on what other people are doing, or do you change, or do you mutate a few things and so on? These are questions that are still open. So the questions we asked is there such a thing as an interdisciplinary professional? If you are, then what kind of title do you put on your email or your business card? Basic things like that. In my case, in my experience as an architect, all I knew was professions around the architecture field. Anything outside of that was vague. So coming into contact with other people, anthropologists and so forth, was something quite new. So there was a bit of a disorientation in that first phase. The second phase was in terms of actually trying to then work together with other people. Now, I assume in the field out there, it's still quite difficult because people work in their own silos and in their own mental frames. But I'm lucky in that my field in academia forces me to interact with other professionals anyway. So with other expertise and so forth. And what is interesting is that knowing that I have become much more sensitive in terms of what other expertise can do for a project. So I realize I don't know everything. But certainly because I'm also still teaching in an interdisciplinary course anyway, the students I work with assume that I know a lot more than I do. As a result, one of two things has to happen. I will either have to defer some of the questions to other experts, right? Alternatively, I have to learn really quickly whatever their needs are. And as such, being involved in this interdisciplinary masters has caused me to learn a lot more than I had intended, and I've had to learn very fast. So it's actually very good for me in that sense. So I've become more interdisciplinary because I'm teaching a course that is interdisciplinary. The simplest way to get to that is that one of the missing links in development approach generally is this ahistorical approach to problems. We seem to approach it as if, this poverty just dropped out of the sky somewhere and, now we're trying to fix it. And because you leave out the history of the causes of these things, you actually ignore the cause, which means you don't really address the real problem. What you do address in the end is just symptoms of the problem. Now, if you apply that to housing, I can best illustrate that through an example. I wrote about it recently. There is a small community, I believe it's in Bangkok. It's near the Panfa Bridge, so it's right in the middle of the city. So essentially, the city kind of grew around it. At some point, the city of Bangkok wanted to raise the place to the ground and to build a new park or something like that. And for years, for decades, these communities were struggling to fight against the eviction, trying to lay claim to that space, and they were not making much of headway. But in the end, I think a year or so before, the city came up with a new policy, and they declared Bangkok as a tourist destination, but also a very how to say heritage-based tourism. And the king was behind it, and it was a whole big thing. And that was meant to then aid in the eviction of all of these unsightly developments in the city. Interestingly enough, the residents got together with a few of the other activists and academics, and they turned that idea around, and they decided to label their village, let's call it, as a heritage location, showing authentic life from 100 years ago and that sort of thing. And they really do live that way. They are not actors. They live exactly like that. So they actually relabeled themselves and sold themselves based on that same discourse. And in that sense, literally capturing that same discourse, which was meant to evict them. And now because of that, they are known as this heritage location. And that is how power is exercised. And in that sense, it's a way that captures the very system that is trying to undo them. That is I suppose that I would say that's a very clear example of what system capture is, and in the location of urbanism, I suppose. But that idea can be, I suppose, translocated to other disciplines, other situations. I try to locate that particular example within the historical perspective of development. So if I was to work in a slum community, for example, before I do anything, I would need to understand what are the historical causes of that. Were these people evicted from somewhere? Did they just lay claim to that land? Where did this land belong? Where are those sites of power? Where are those frictions? And that is where you intervene. It's not in simply saying, oh, there are poor people there, let's build something better. Because you don't know who you're coming up against, you don't know what is causing that situation in the greater scheme. So the historical approach and the contextual approach is critical. Otherwise, to be perfectly frank, you are most likely doing more harm than good. You also have to understand, I have alluded to and not really put my finger to the fact that we are working in a neoliberal context now. So as such, a lot of things are the responsibility of the people, although they are recommended by those in power, in essence. That's really the point of neoliberalism. It's yeah. So it's, on the one hand, I don't necessarily agree with that. The difference now, if you look at the housing approach we have now, it sounds good. It sounds like it's an empowering discourse, but in reality, it's tough. In the 60s, it was about the state actually taking responsibility for their populations and providing housing and providing basic needs from the state coffers, and that is what taxes are for. So I do still subscribe to that idea that the state needs to come back into the picture. The state needs to provide basic infrastructure and so forth. But while that is happening, the people should not be passive either. So I'm not supporting one extreme or the other. In essence, the interest that I have is to get the two discourses that have always appeared to be mutually, how to say, mutually exclusive, to put them together in a more nuanced way. So we found out the weaknesses of the state, and now we are finding out the weaknesses of the neoliberal approach. There are good things and bad things in both sides, and I think a mix is a much better approach.